Well, welcome to the Chek blog, everybody. I'm glad to have you back. I'm also glad to have our good friend Jator Pierre with us here today. How are you, Jator? I ask you that because I actually know that you don't like that question, and
You
what you
know,
need in your life is a little annoyance from me on camera.
what I appreciate most about what you shared, James, is a lot of people know that I don't like that question, so they purposefully ask it.
So what you're
Yeah.
telling me is that I'm actually commonplace. That my joke was not nearly as clever as I thought it was.
Well, if that's how you heard it, what I heard myself say is, I'm a human being. I still get triggered. I still get annoyed, and one reason why that question is annoying to me is because I think I still judge and criticize, at least in part, the parts of myself that are habitual in nature. And that's what that question represents for me, is a habitual pattern. So I find a lot of frustration with my own habitual patterns, and I'm learning to accept that question so I can learn to also accept myself about that question. Which might bring up the word that you started us with off camera, which I can't remember anymore because
Obfuscate.
confused.
Yes. But I'm glad you're with me today because we had talked off camera, off and on about a topic for our next session, and I'm really looking forward to it. Because what I wanted you to talk about was defensiveness. And I think this is a really important topic for, specifically for our students, but probably for anybody out there. Because what I was hoping, Jator, we've been talking about a little bit offline about, is to talk about where defensiveness comes from and how you, Jator, and one in general can work with somebody who's thrown up these sort of walls of defensiveness and to sort of get through those walls.
Yeah, it's a good question. Where it comes from.
Mm.
Mm. Yeah, a lot of these topics that we chat about are super wide and deep
Yeah.
topics
Right.
that we try to cover in an hour, and typically you try to keep me to a half an hour.
I've given
Um,
up on that. I promise you.
yeah. And, you know, it's kind of like when we think about a lot of the information that we hear about stress. Typically, at least in my experience, we go to this, oh, well, stress is bad place, and it's not all bad. Or defensiveness is bad. And I think it's a great place to start, which is defensiveness is not necessarily a negative thing. That every aspect, at least in my experience of it, has some light and shadow to it. Um, I tend to have a hard time finding the light side of defensiveness. But some of those light sides would be, and this also leads to where it comes from, is because we all have egos and ego parts, uh, we need, in part at least, to defend our stories.
Mm.
We need to defend our self-identifications. We need to defend our attachments. And maybe an oversimplification is one reason we do that is because we need to defend who we think we are, inclusive of our ideas, our values, our familiar values in terms of our family of origin, who we think we are. And why is that? Well, it helps us feel safe and in control. When we look at things that actually cause the human being stress, one of the largest of them is a sense of not being in control. So most of what our ego does on a daily basis is create the illusion of control so that we can feel safe, secure, and familiar. And that's where, defense comes in, is because defense holds up those barriers to keep us where we are right now. because change or changing our mind or seeing things from another perspective to parts of us is actually very scary, because it means we have to let down our walls. It means we have to let down our shell. And it means that we have to let go of the illusion of we are in control to allow ourselves to hear another perspective. And, in my experience as well, interestingly, a lot of us as children learned to connect with our family members through tension. Not everyone learned to connect through respect and harmony. A lot of us learned to connect through tension and defendedness and offensiveness. So it's kind of this story that follows us around, one, from our childhood, and two, from the perspective of thinking we need to defend ourselves from an outside world that is always trying to attack us or change us or push opinion on us. And it helps us feel a sense of control. It helps us feel safe. It also helps us feel self-righteous and arrogant. And all of those things, interestingly enough, feel good to parts of us. If I'm in the know and I can defend my position and I can make sure that you know that I know more than you know because I have the logic to prove and back up my story, that helps me put myself up on a pedestal, put you down, so that I can create the illusion of I'm in control, I'm in the power seat, you're less than me. And it's a very, very powerful control drama, is why we defend.
Right. And I mentioned, there's a fear of being, is there, part of that, I guess, maybe it goes down to exactly what you're saying, but it seems like there's a fear of being wrong, right? I mean, from very early on, right? I mean, think of when you're in first grade, right? And you got a paper, something, an assignment back, right? What is the color your grades are given to you? What is the color that the things that are marked wrong are given to you? You're associating all these signs with being wrong with bad, right? And I wonder how much of it, I mean, in addition to what you're saying, is just, we've been taught being wrong is bad.
Oh, I love it. I love that there are so many threads to this sweater that we couldn't cover them all.
Right.
And your thread is, for me, dead on. It's this fear of being shamed, which a lot of us were, for being wrong based on logic. It's one reason why so many of us are afraid, at least in my opinion, to be illogical, to be emotional, to be imaginative, to be curious, because that is a very open perspective. But because a lot of us lose that perspective as children is because when we would demonstrate that or show that, we would be shamed for it, whether it was a literal shaming or our experience of it, like getting an F with a big fat red marker. And we feel this sense of shame, or we see how our parents and our family react to that grade. Then it becomes very scary to be wrong. And I mean, I've noticed this in myself. I'm still defensive. And one thing that I try not to do anymore, which I think I'm almost there, is noticing when you're in let's say a dialogue or even an argument with somebody. And somewhere in that argument or that dialogue, you realize and recognize, you know what? Actually, their perspective is on point and a little bit more clear than mine. And what they're saying actually is starting to resonate with me a lot more than what I'm saying. And what I find really interesting about that is that we can be so afraid of being wrong or so afraid of being vulnerable that even when we get flushed with that feeling, we will disregard it and continue to defend our position, to feel like we're in control, to feel like we're not getting that red, that red grade, and also to facilitate the other side of it, which is to feel a sense of shame and or fear about not being soft and open and allowing that little boy or that little girl out to say, I've had a good think and a good feel about what you're sharing, and my perspective has changed, and I actually think you're right, and thank you. My perspective has changed, and I apologize for, whatever the indiscretion might have been. It's a really, really interesting place of how defensiveness actually keeps us walled off. It keeps us separate, and it allows our ego to feel in control. It feels then in control of us, rather than learning to slowly over time, us be in control of our ego.
Yeah, and I think those two things tying together, it seems like they do pretty well, right? Because until recently, it seemed like facts weren't something that facts were just there, right? And you could be, you could be wrong about what the facts were. And so when a teacher tells you, no, you're wrong, well, there's a connection between it there, because I don't have control over the world and I don't understand it. And so being wrong is one way of throwing that lack of control in your face.
Yeah. It's also a way of, being wrong is another way that people then pedestal themselves and put you down. So said it another way.
Yeah, right.
It's a way that it helps them feel big so you feel small. And we're all at different times play different roles. And we all kind of have propensities. Some of us like to shame others so that we can feel big and they feel small. Some of us like to get shamed so we can feel small and make others feel big. So it's a two-way street. And what's really fascinating to me about defensiveness is that it helps us stay stuck, which is good and bad if you want to frame it that way. It helps us stay protected. And it also inhibits us from growing. Growing maybe not taller, but maybe wider. Maybe not more vertical than others. And when I say grow, what I mean is growing internally to a sense of more compassion and more empathy for yourself, as well as more compassion and empathy and understanding of other people's perspectives and way of living life. And that for a lot of us is really hard and threatening to do because we need to defend our position, which helps us feel in control. As soon as we start to become less defended, we have lots of stories, a lot of us, of getting hurt. Think about when you were a little kid and you got hurt being the soft little boy on the playground and some bully, picked on you. That in and of itself, that moment can be enough to solidify, I'm going to be hard and close my heart to protect myself. And the interesting thing for me about that story then is, fast forwarding, the moments where we feel defensive is a reminder to look back to when these moments happen to us as a mirror reflection to explore, wow, why am I being defensive? What am I protecting? What don't I want to see? What am I afraid of? And typically, my experience is at least that defensiveness typically comes with an emotional charge of anger. Not always, but let's just say typically. And anger, interestingly enough, for adults, for the most part, is the way that adults express fear and or shame. Because when you're a kid, it's almost comfortable to tell someone you're afraid or ashamed or embarrassed. But as we learn that that's not okay, we learn another language, and that language is the language of anger. And that's how we then are accepted for expressing these other emotions. As a very easy symbol, when you're driving your car and someone cuts you off, a lot of the response is to drive next to the person and flip them the bird. Mm-hmm. Right? So anger. A very rare response would be you get cut off and then you drive up next to the person, you roll down your window, and you say to them, "Hey, are you okay? I got really scared." Because that's what happened. You got really scared. But you're afraid to say that you're really scared. So the way that you defend that position and hide your fear is by expressing anger. So defensiveness is super multifaceted and is a very interesting topic.
So in light of that kind of complexity and the sort of the depth of defensiveness, how do you work with a client when you get that response really quickly to say a change that you propose?
Yeah, my experience has been that one of the most powerful ways to work with that is to recognize I'm defensive too. Because why is that? Well, because then when I'm working with someone else, I have a lot more compassion and empathy for them being defensive. Because I understand what it's like to be defensive and why I defend positions. So if I can come into conversations, whether it's a client or significant other or friend or parent, with the understanding of, oh yeah, defensiveness is okay, and to acknowledge it in myself helps me to acknowledge it in others rather than being defended about their defensiveness. So if I have a client who's very defended, I allow myself to feel that, observe it, and something that's, in the coaching world that I think is really, really powerful, which is meeting clients where they are at. I think a lot of us, inclusive of myself at times as a coach, forget that mantra. And that mantra is really important because it essentially means to meet a person exactly where they are and reduce the amount of agenda I have to change them into who I want them to be. Therefore, if they show up defended, I'm thinking in my mind and I'm feeling in my heart, wow, cool. This person's defended. How do we work with this? Where can we go from here? Where might be subject matter that they don't feel as defended about? So I can start to play with ideas with them around other subjects where they don't feel as defended. They start to open up, and then we start to create a dialogue or a connection, not through agenda and pushing, but through very open, compassionate, and maybe a little bit more hard energy. And then we start to create the experience of being less defended. I.e., if I show up defended as a coach, then I'm modeling the behavior to my client. If I show up less defended as a coach as best I can, then I'm modeling a very different behavior. And there's a lot of learning that occurs through modeling. In fact, James, modeling is a huge, huge way human beings learn. So if you model a behavior around anyone, typically that behavior will be influencing. As an example, I tend to talk at a pretty slow clip, and I do that purposefully. And people who talk at a faster rate will slow down a bit, and I'll speed up a bit. And we'll kind of get to a closer cadence. We won't maybe always get to the same cadence, But the subconscious modeling and the unconscious modeling that's going on is very, very powerful to behavior change. It's why one of the Chek principles is experience this work. Experience the 6 principles. Experience the 4 doctors. Practice it. Move it into your life. Practice it for yourself. Why is that? Because then you become the model of the behavior. You're not showing up and talking out of a lot of theory. You're sharing a lot of information from your personal experience, and then your client gets to take that information and create their personal experience with it, which may be different than yours, and that's okay too.
I wonder, part of the way that I'm hearing, or one way that I'm hearing what you're saying is that you don't want us to set up a power struggle between you and your client. And if they are defensive and you are defensive, or if they are defensive and you go about trying to change them, right, then inevitably what that does sound, it sounds like you're saying that it sets up a power struggle.
Yes. And I'm not saying that that's right across the board, because I'm giving voice to how I approach things as a coach. Because in general right now, there's 2 kind of theories on coaching. There's the expert model and there's the collaborative model. And I subscribe more to the collaborative model, which is my client is the chief. My client knows what's best for my client. It's my job to offer perspective and guidance for that client then to choose his or her own path about that information. And there's a very interesting thing that happens with the collaborative model, which almost seems like, well, wait a second, Jator, client's in charge? Is that it imbues a sense of autonomy. And human beings love autonomy and love to feel like they're in control. So it's actually a really subtle way to seduce people into doing what you want them to do, because they're making the choice. So if I offer 5 different things and that person picks the one that resonates most with them, in their mind and heart, I'm making that choice. Win for the client and win for Jator, because of those 4 or 5 things, those are 4 or 5 things I want to do anyways.
Right.
So it reduces that struggle.
Yeah, I wonder even for the expert model whether, part of what happened, it also sounds to me like part of what you're talking about is not just a way of helping your client to change, but just a way of connecting with them too, right? And so even if you're in that expert mode, you want to be able to connect with your client or the expert model. And it sounds like kind of what you're proposing is there's 2 parts to it, right? And the expert needs to find a way to connect with a client.
Yeah, I really appreciate that reflection. It brings up for me that maybe one of the most important aspects of change is connection. And that connection also reduces defensiveness. And one of the maybe the most important parts of connection is acknowledgement. So by understanding that a person's defensive and that's okay, and even acknowledging that, hey, in my experience, it feels like you're a little defensive right now. Is that true? Yeah, I am feeling defensive. Oh, cool. Not a bad thing. Cool. Green marker.
Right. Yeah.
Cool. What are you feeling defensive about? Yeah. What's coming up for you? That interest and that acknowledgement of feeling is a very, very different way of connecting with yourself and other human beings, which we're typically used to the opposite. We're typically used to defensiveness to your defensiveness, offensiveness to your defensiveness, and or no acknowledgement. and not acknowledging the feeling, which also brings up for a lot of us the sense of being unacknowledged as children, the sense of not being seen, not being heard. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say every human being on the planet wants one thing, and that is attention. And they're going to figure out how to get it. Whether it's through being defensive or compliant or defiant, they're going to figure out how to get it. So for me, the softer pathways to connection is through acknowledgement and respect and being okay that we have differing ideas. And that's okay.
Yeah. And there's another part of this that I'm curious about too. Like, and maybe you were already in this space when you started working with clients, but like, how do you not get frustrated when you run up against a client who is being very defensive?
Yeah, man, that's a great question. I'm going to go ahead and say that took me about 20 years to learn because it's honest. It's honest. And one of the ways that I found out of that feeling of letting go of the frustration is it also comes with letting go of the story and the agenda that it's my job to fix you or change you. If I can let go of that, which for a lot of coaches, that's going to make absolutely no sense. It almost sounds like maybe you're not doing your job.
Yeah.
The paradox of that is if you can allow people to be themselves and you reduce the amount of need that you have to feel good about yourself and who you are as a person because other people listen to what you tell them, then your feelings and your experiences of life are going to be a lot less dependent on what other people do or do not do. So I had to give myself something else for my ego to get out of coaching rather than people changing. I'm a change agent. I had to change that framework because as long as I had that framework, I'm going to feel some sense of not just frustration. I'm going to feel a sense of fear and or shame that I'm not a good coach. Yeah. So to give my ego some other food, my other food has become, what is this client here to teach me about myself? So if a client's very defended, at the end of the session, I get to go and explore, wow, what parts of me are still very defended? If my client's very angry or hurt or scared or in pain, wow, those are all beautiful places that I get to hear someone else explore themselves, support that process, and then I get to learn about myself, which gives my ego some food to feel some sense of purpose in my work.
Yeah. Whenever we talk, you always lead me to so many more questions that are probably not quite related to what we're talking about today. I mean, because one of the things that comes out of what you just said that I think is wonderful is just how we think about people and what we think a client is as a person. And if you think of, maybe they don't, you won't think of a client exactly in these terms, but if you kind of think of your client as this clockwork being, right? Where, this client really just has this sprocket broken and this spring is too mushy, right? And I just need to replace that, right? And we're going to do that through nutrition and we're going to do that through, I don't know, whatever, lifting weights. That seems like where you're going to run into real problems, right? This very ego-driven, I'm going to fix you kind of thing, and where you might attach your own personal value to the fixing, right? But if you don't view clients in that way, then maybe some of the reaction to defensiveness or to feeling like you need to be the fixer can that can go away.
Yeah, it's really interesting how many of us, at least in my experience, who get into this type of work are rescuers by nature. And we get a lot of our emotional needs met by rescuing. And that comes at a cost. It comes at a cost of a lot of codependency in our relationships, especially with our clients. Yeah. And you and I have chatted about this before. It's becoming the client's parent that you want to be really careful of, because clients have their own experiences with their parents, yeah. which are vast. Yeah. So the faster you become a client's parent, the faster you're going to also be dealing with the inner child of that client. Yeah. So my perspective is, if I need to parent for a certain amount of time, I will, but I'll give voice to that. I'm playing the role of a functional parent now. I'll say that out loud. I'm playing the role of a parent right now so that we can both hear it. Because that's important to breaking up that vibration of attachment and what this is going to be long term. Yeah. I'm going to parent you for a bit or in this moment until you learn to parent yourself. It's like as an example of that, because that might seem a little out there. I ask a client a question and they're struggling to find their own answer. They're racking their brain and they're racking their heart and they're struggling. I can ask the question after I allow space for them to struggle, because struggle is also important. If you can allow yourself to step back from feeling the need to not let them struggle and allow that struggle to occur, they're actually learning a lot through their processing and their struggle process. I can sit there in that silent space and hold space with them. And if they're still not able to find their way out, what I can do then is I can say, are you open to me offering an opinion? Are you open to me shining a different angle on this? An opinion. And I'm using the language of opinion very purposefully, because the language of opinion means I'm owning my perspective and not saying that this needs to be yours too. Therefore, I just get to shine a different angle. They get to hear another angle and then still make their own choice and opinion around which way to go forward or sideways or backwards. That is very empowering then to the client, for them to become their own coach or their own guru or their own, whatever else is out there.
Right. And I imagine that's when the real breakthroughs happen, with these walls of defense that they've put up.
Yeah, and something around that walls of defense is, as a coach, for me, it's really important to listen with your heart, hear with your heart behind your client's words or the vibration of their words, and to really listen beneath the surface, not at the surface. And as an example, I had a client last week who, in our conversation, in our first meeting, there was a lot of defensiveness. Not toward me, but toward some other ideas that this person had heard out there before meeting with me. And I just took a mental note of, And when that person went against what was suggested and did their own thing, they felt miraculously better. So what does that immediately tell me? It tells me that this person does not like to be told what to do. So I have to raise my invitation language way, way, way high to invite them into things so they feel extremely autonomous about their decision, and then it'll get done at a much faster rate.
Wow. Well, this idea of who is your client, or how do you think about your clients, is a topic that I think we should save for another session. because I think it's really fascinating, and it seems like, almost like a centerpiece of how you would run your whole practice.
I 100% agree, and something that's what we can talk about. But something that's been really powerful for me is learning really to be undefended about who I am as a coach, and not needing to show or prove or be who I think other people think I should be as a coach. And once I let go of wanting to be Paul or wanting to be JP or wanting to be John or wanting to be Chris, as soon as I started to really let go of those stories and allowed Jator to come through, that's when my business became much more successful. And that's when I started to really attract the people that wanted to work with how I resonate and how I coach. And each of us will find that. Can you allow yourself to be undefended to yourself, to let yourself out?
That's really fascinating. This idea that defensiveness can actually inhibit your being authentic.
Well said.
Wow. And that, I imagine it has to be true for both me as a practitioner, but for a client as well.
Yes. I mean, that's such a deep statement that if we take that anywhere else, we'll be on another hour. But let that sink in. Everyone who's still with us, let that sink in. Right. Because that's sunk into my heart for sure.
Well, this has been fantastic, Jator. I feel like there's a lot of things that I need to go back and kind of re-listen to this, but this is really wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, James, for being undefended enough to invite me onto your show multiple times.
Yes, that's a mark of my enlightenment, I guess, because I'll keep having you back time after time.
Sounds good, brother. I love sharing. It's really fun and enjoyable to me, and it's also part of my work about letting my defensives go is actually showing up with you and doing videos and really expressing truly how I feel and how I think no matter what happens. And that is actually really scary. And it takes, for me, it takes a lot of courage to show my true colors.
I know it takes you a lot of courage to be on a show hosted by me. Well, thanks again, Jator. I'm really grateful that you do take the time to share with me and to share with our viewers. So thanks.
You're welcome.